Okay, so welcome to Ecopsychology Voices, an interview series with some of ecopsychology's luminaries. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the sponsor of this event. Linda Buzzell and I are co-hosts of the Ecopsychology Voices series, and today she is our interviewer. Linda has been a psychotherapist for over 40 years, and for half of that time has specialized in ecopsychology and ecotherapy. Linda and Craig Chalquist edited the Sierra Club Books anthology, Ecotherapy, Healing with Nature in Mind. Today, Linda will interview Zhiwa Woodbury. Linda?
Thank you, Carol. And I'd like to start with just giving a little biography of Zhiwa so we kind of know a little bit about his background. Zhiwa Woodbury is an ecopsychologist. He has a doctorate in natural law and a master's degree in ecopsychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies. He trained in caregiving with Zen Hospice Project in San Francisco. He's a regular contributor for truthout.org on climate issues. And his latest book is Climate Sense, Changing the Way We Think and Feel About Our Climate in Crisis. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Zhiwa.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks, Carol. I think that's the first time I've ever been called a luminary. That kind of felt nice. I'm not sure what it means, but it sounds luminous. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining. This is a kind of a new idea, so I asked Carol and Linda if I couldn't begin with a kind of tutorial about climate trauma to sort of lay the groundwork for any discussion and further thinking. So I'm calling this the new psychology of the climate crisis. And it's in response to this climate paradox. This is what I've been struggling with for a number of years, and I'm sure many of you as well. The science is quite clear. If we don't take drastic actions now, and scientists have been telling this for over a decade, then under the best case scenarios, we're condemning future generations to an impoverished world, while under the worst, the future will not include human beings. So why then are we not taking appropriate action? That's the paradox that we all face. Western psychologists have been trying to answer that question for a number of years without a lot of success, and with some rather sort of wonky kind of approaches. And as an ecopsychologist, we would say the problem is that they're coming from a scientific materialist perspective that still objectifies nature and still sees human beings as apart from nature. And so it's kind of hard for them to figure out what's going on. The truth of the matter is the climate is not something out there in the world apart from us, and that this is a personal crisis. I think of this as a kind of quantum awareness, and you'll sort of get the idea there that it's based on the sort of emerging worldview from both ecopsychology and quantum physics. And you can see this quote from Andy Fisher, who wrote a seminal book called Radical Ecopsychology, which was very formative in my own thinking. And Randy calls this one flesh, all phenomena interweave as a single cloth or a common tissue that are mutually informative. And they're commingling with one another because they are of the same elemental stuff. And sort of ironically, as Andy is very much against science, sort of a critic of science, his view is very much in keeping with the father of quantum physics, Werner Heisenberg. Many years ago said the world thus appears as a complicated tissue of events in which connections of different kinds alternate or overlap or combine and thereby determine the texture of the whole. So this is like a radical new way of seeing the world that's been around for over 50 years, but still is just taking hold. And this is what informs my thinking. This is a plug here for a British magazine that's going to be published tomorrow, Climate Minds Ontology of Unpsychology magazine. And I have a contribution in there called Taking the Climate Crisis Personally. And this, a quote from the article says, from the ecopsychological perspective, the climate crisis could not be coming from any deeper in here. The road to recovery for our climate, for our planet, and for our children's children thus begins with admitting that we have a nature problem, not just in the collective sense, and this is the important point, but in each one of our lives personally. And so that's why I would like to begin by saying, hi, my name is Zhiwa, and I'm having a climate crisis.
Hi, Zhiwa.
Thank you. All right, so here's the thing. Is it climate change or is it climate trauma? So the word trauma is used to describe experiences or situations that are emotionally painful and distressing and that overwhelm people's ability to cope, leaving them feeling powerless. According to the comprehensive textbook of psychiatry, the common denominator of psychological trauma is a feeling of intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, and threat of annihilation. I mean, anybody who's given the climate crisis any thought realizes those are pretty good descriptions of what I'm feeling. So now compare that to the American Psychology Association's response to climate crisis, which is a periodical called Beyond Storms. While existing research has focused primarily on the mental health effects of climate change that will come about from disasters, climate change's more gradual effects, like rising temperatures and changing landscapes, also have important implications for human psychology. Major mental health impacts include increases in the incidence of stress, anxiety, and depression, as well as increases in more severe reactions like post-traumatic stress disorder. So note that they can't bring themselves to call the climate crisis trauma, but what they're describing there fits right into the model of traumatic event causing, and if you look at in this diagram, all these things, these symptoms of trauma are a pretty good description of our culture right now. Breakdowns in relationships, psychic numbing, interpersonal conflicts that are accelerating, learning problems, difficulty concentrating with all of our smartphones and everything, low self-esteem, irritability, so anxiety, restlessness, depression. So if you, instead of thinking of this as climate change that's causing trauma, if you think of it as climate trauma, then it changes the whole way we would relate to the issue. And so my definition of climate trauma is a sustained life-threatening assault on the biosphere, which of course we're a part of. And Benjamin White, in a special issue of Ecopsychology that Linda co-edited with Craig Chalkris, he is the one that has come closest to he's an inspiration to me in this article he wrote, and he comes closest to naming the disease. And he says climate change seems to embody a trauma response on a grand scale, the greatest trauma on the grandest scale. And so that's part of what prompted me to think, yeah, it's climate trauma. I'm not going to go over this in detail. You can come back to this, but basically what I'm doing here is just recognizing what our current thinking of trauma is at three different levels: the individual level, generational, which recent studies show we actually inherit from our fathers through a genetic stenting of the RNA in the sperm cells. Cultural trauma, which we've all experienced with assassinations or 9/11, which and more graphic examples would be Jewish culture from the Holocaust and Native Americans from genocide, and of course black people from slavery. So those are that's the existing sort of model of trauma. And then if you think of climate trauma, it's basically a superordinate form of trauma because of its ever-present nature and its growing existential threat. So this is something that's constant as opposed to an event. And it calls into question what it means to be human. So what, you might think, well, here's the thing about trauma. Whenever we experience trauma, it is said that all past traumas become present. And that trauma triggers our limbic system of fight, flight, or fright. So if climate trauma is ever present and a growing threat to our existence, what it should mean then is that it is causing all of our past traumas to be present. And by not acknowledging climate change as trauma, we end up with dissociation as being the primary characteristic of our response, which again, according to White, is the human capacity to mentally escape an insufferable reality. Another way of thinking about it is looking at those who are dealing with it most directly, the frontline responders. And this quote here is from Camille Parmesan, who's a Nobel Peace Prize winner in climate issues, who says she does not know of a single scientist that is not having an emotional reaction to what is being lost. And then it naturally follows that as the findings are more extensively read and the climate impacts more widely felt, the psychological distress will also increase proportionately. We're all starting to sort of share in that. And I like to say, to people, we're all in denial when it comes to climate crisis, climate trauma. White, again, from that article by Benjamin White, he says in relation to climate change, a traumatic reality that often seems hard to acknowledge, dissociation is a blatantly relevant concept, and dissociative processes are likely applicable at several levels of the phenomenon of climate change. The prevailing view of climate denial implies a conscious choice not to accept the reality of climate change. Dissociation is a concept that transcends the notion of denial, and since it is tied to trauma theory, offers more promising suggestions for steps towards resolution. Which brings us to this question, which I hope everybody is giving a lot of thought to. Well, this idea of powerlessness or helplessness, according to Judith Herman, who wrote the book Trauma and Recovery, helplessness and isolation are the core experiences of psychological trauma. And so that's kind of, when we're not even acknowledging climate change as trauma, then we can expect to feel helpless and sort of isolated in our experiences. Empowerment and reconnection are the core experiences of recovery. So by acknowledging climate change as trauma, then we can start focusing on recovery for ourselves, and then eventually recovery for the planet itself, which would follow. And the only way past trauma is through trauma. And thus Trump and Black Lives Matter, all these cause celebs, all these issues that are interjecting themselves into the public sphere right now are all basically bringing our past traumas, as cultural trauma especially, to the forefront. For slavery, we have Black Lives Matter. For the genocide of Native Americans, we have the Standing Rock and ongoing movement against expansion of pipelines and so forth. The Civil War monuments is a really good example of how we're still dealing with that trauma, the trauma of the Civil War. The Me Too movement, which, bringing up the sexual subjugation trauma and kind of a metaphor for the planetary situation. Well, again, the Never Again movement. And, these just keep piling up, and it's a good thing because, they are symptomatic, but it's important that we're starting to actually address these things in a way that hopefully will lead to systemic change. I see it as the beginnings of a truth and reconciliation process on a national and global scale. And Naomi Klein sort of reinforces that with her book, This Changes Everything, meaning that we can't just address any of these issues apart from each other because they're all connected. And then the question, becomes how do we plug the climate trauma into this equation? And, if we're dealing with all the symptoms, how do we actually start addressing the disease? And, what I'm going to suggest is that that's obviously happening as well. And if we were to acknowledge if we were to name the disease and acknowledge the real root of it, this idea of climate trauma, then we will feel actually empowered to help bring about the change that needs to happen at societal levels. And this is, I'd like to basically touch a little bit on this idea of quantum activism and the idea of climate clubs and climate cafes, and basically the idea of starting conversation, because that's sort of how we deal psychologically with trauma, is through relationship. And so basically there is someone that has I'm not the first one to suggest how we should actually be addressing the climate crisis. The Pope Francis has actually done an amazing, made an amazing contribution to this. And this is precisely what he's trying to do, is start this conversation. And so with every kind of a problem like this, whether it's Alcoholics Anonymous or climate trauma, we have to start by acknowledging that we have a problem, that we're experiencing, that we're in crisis. And the problem that I've seen, the reason we're stuck is because of this political model we have of climate change as a political issue, which is, expecting the solution to come from the top down. That there is no political solution to the climate crisis, and anybody who's really paying attention to the Paris Accords will understand that, and understand why James Hansen, Dr. Hansen, is so critical of that. It's actually a form of dissociation at a global scale. So it's not a political crisis. It's not a technological problem. There are no technological solutions to climate trauma. At its root, it's a spiritual crisis. It's a spiritual issue. It's a very personal issue. And really what it comes right down to is it's a relational issue. So in order to recover and to enter into recovery, we have to change the way we relate to ourselves and get, it's up to each of us individually to reconnect with our own human nature and sort of do the examination of what that means. From there, we can change our relationship to our loved ones. From there, we can change our relationship in our community and start changing things at a communal level. And then then everything else will follow from that and flow from that. And so as an example, or to reinforce this idea, I just wanted to share a couple of brief statements or paragraphs from Laudato Si, the Pope's encyclical. And he says, when we speak of environment, what we really mean is a relationship existing between nature and the society which lives in it. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. Given the scale of climate change, it is no longer possible to find a specific, discrete answer for each part of the problem. It is essential to seek comprehensive solutions which consider the interactions within natural systems themselves and with social systems. We are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. And I would submit that complex crisis is climate trauma. And so the Pope issues this urgent appeal for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all. The worldwide ecological movement has already made considerable progress and led to the establishment of numerous organizations committed to raising awareness of these challenges. Regrettably, many efforts to seek concrete solutions to the environmental crisis have proved ineffective, not only because of powerful opposition, but also because of a more general lack of interest. Obstructionist attitudes on the part of believers can range from denial of the problem to indifference, nonchalant resignations, or blind confidence in technical solutions. We require a new and universal solidarity. So this is, to me, what the Pope is talking about is really a model for recovery from climate trauma. And what I'm suggesting is that rather than feeling disempowered by the lack of political progress on the climate crisis, or by the fact that we have a madman in the White House or whatever, what we need to do is take responsibility for ourselves in our communities and do simple things like start climate clubs, you know, focused around book study group, you know, doing book study as a vehicle for getting people to start exchanging their feelings and talking about their feelings and working through and processing through their own feelings about the crisis, because inevitably that leads to questioning our relationship with each other, our lifestyles, and in our community, and in our relationships with the natural world, wherever we happen to live. So I wrote a book that is focused on that sort of processing, changing the way we think and feel about our climate and crisis. But there are so many amazing books that could easily be taken up in this type of a group setting, climate club, I'm calling that, just as a generic term. Like, we know, of course, Joanna Macy's books, Act of Hope, Coming Back to Life. We have Charles Eisenstein's The More Beautiful World, Our Hearts Know Is Possible. Of course, Laudato Si, I think, you know, you can download it for free. Same thing with Charles Eisenstein's book. You can download that for free online, but if you're a bibliophile like me, you know, it helps to have something that you can highlight. But this is a beautiful book for processing through the difficult emotions and issues that we have in relation to the climate crisis. And so I just want to end here the presentation here with this quote from Michael J. Fox about acceptance, because, you know, if we process through our feelings of grief in relation to the climate crisis and what we've lost, what we're losing, what we stand to lose, eventually we arrive at acceptance. This is, you know, the hospice model. And Michael J. Fox has a beautiful definition of acceptance here, saying it doesn't mean resignation. It means understanding that something is what it is, and there's got to be a way through it. And that's basically the model that we need to be following in our lives, and in order to change the way to empower ourselves and our communities to actually resolve climate trauma. And from that, everything else will flow.
Oh, thank you, Zhiwa. That's wonderful. I've got a lot of questions, and I'm sure other people do as well. So let me just start with this one. There seems to be a perception that climate and environment is an issue, just like every other social issue, and that our social movements seem to be kind of siloed, where we're basically just focused on our own particular identity issue. My concerns as a woman trump anything else, or my concerns as this type of person or that person. How do we help everyone understand that this is an issue that we're all involved in, that it's not just certain people who care about the environment, that it's actually something that affects everyone.
Excuse me, Linda, before Zhiwa answers that, can you stop sharing your screen? I think it's at the top.
I don't think I'm sharing, am I?
No, but Zhiwa is still sharing his screen.
Oh, okay.
At the very, very top of your screen, I think there's a stop share. Go up higher.
Ah, found it. Sorry,
There we go. Okay, super. Okay.
Okay. So do you want me to repeat that, Zhiwa?
How do we get people in our communities? You're basically asking to recognize the crisis?
Not so much that. I'm talking about how we've become very siloed in terms of how we see political, cultural issues. And that because of the whole identity politics thing, that we're, a lot of us are concerned with our issue, whatever that issue is, where we feel disempowered or we feel that's the most important issue. And it seems like climate change has been siloed itself into that's just one more political issue. And somehow the people concerned about environment are not necessarily seen as having, I don't know, it's like we've been disconnected from it in a way, because we're focused on our own human issues and we think of, well, we got to deal with that first. That's really important. I mean, the social justice issues in particular. So we'll think about the environment later. Does that make any sense?
Well, I mean, that's basically, that's basically we have a culture that's based on dealing with symptoms and not the disease.
Right.
And so the way to sort of broach that discussion, I think, with people is to say, whatever your issue is, it's symptomatic of a larger problem. That's, I think pretty much everybody can recognize that society's really out of whack right now. And it's very polarized. And so rather than, feeding into that polarization and the constant bickering back and forth, I think, we have to recognize that society has gone off the rails. And these are all just symptoms of something that's systemically very wrong. And it has to do, obviously, with how we relate to each other, because screaming at each other is not the sign of a good relationship. But that's what we see this all around us. There's just conflict. So the question is, why is this polarization and balkanization and conflict continually, just accelerating and becoming more and more drastic, to the point that feels like we're on the verge of, world war. And so that, the initial thing is to just sort of get people to acknowledge that underlying these constant arguments, there are all these assumptions that people are making, and underlying all those assumptions are stories. And if we can stop, instead of participating in that sort of argumentative cultural milieu, if we start asking people, what are the assumptions that they're making in defending these positions, then that will give us clues into the stories that are underlying those assumptions. So, I mean, that's sort of just a way of, on a surface level, talking about how do we disengage from that conflict arena. But specifically in relation to the climate crisis, I think we have to take a firm stand that this is not a political issue. That's like saying Alzheimer's is a political issue. Alzheimer's is not a political issue. It's something that we're all dealing with that's causing a lot of difficulty in our lives, and we need help and support in order to deal with the caretaking issues around Alzheimer's, or with gun violence. Even the kids. It's really interesting, the difference between the political or media coverage of the Never Enough campaign by the kids, and actually listening to the kids who recognize it's not just about guns, it's about violence, So I think for those of us who feel more in tune with the larger issues, it's incumbent on us to encourage people to stop dealing with symptoms and start addressing the underlying diseases, and naming those diseases. And I think that there's that we have to be very sensitive when we do that, because we have stigmatized mental illness so much in our culture. But the fact of the matter is that all of these things are indicative of sort of a shared mental illness, and it's the same sort of thing. We have to acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge that there must be something wrong if we put somebody in the White House that has an obvious is suffering from an obvious mental disorder. And I don't say that, in a nasty way. I have great compassion for Donald Trump, because for somebody who is suffering from narcissistic personality disorder, I could not think of a worse position for him to be in, where he's constantly, being criticized. And so yeah, and so I think that it's really important to just say, look, climate trauma is something that we're all experiencing. It affects all of us equally. It's not just a political or an economic concern. But the politicians and those who don't want us to deal with the issue are the ones that are characterizing it that way. That they have an agenda to avoid actually addressing the problem or deferring the problem to future generations by pretending it's an economic issue. I'm an environmental attorney, so their first, and I focus on forest defense. So when it came to saving spotted owls, the response was, "Oh, you're trying to take people's jobs away." Well, no, it's not jobs versus owls. So those kind of false dichotomies are very much a symptom of the polarization of the public. And we just, somehow we have to be able to convince people that we're in this together, and we're not just in it, we are it. It is us. And it is a relational issue. So I think, when it comes to discussing the climate crisis, if you put it in that term, like this is a problem in relationship, it's not a political problem. It's a problem of how we relate to the planet, how we relate to our environment, and that means how are we relating to each other. All of those things are connected. So
Okay, well, thank you very much, Zhiwa. We're going to end the recording here and open it up to discussion from everyone. But you've given us a wonderful presentation and a lot to think about. So thank you.
That was